What if the foundations of modern society were built not just on laws and progress, but on invisible contracts of exclusion? What if the very notion of justice we celebrate was never designed for all? Racial injustice is not just a flaw in the system. It is the system, as some great minds have argued. But throughout history, courageous philosophers and thinkers have risen to question, to resist, and to reimagine. From Du Bois' piercing insight into double consciousness, to Kimberlé Crenshaw's concept of intersectionality, these voices haven't merely described racism, they've decoded it. Join us in this journey through the intellectual and moral revolutions led by visionaries who dared to ask, what does it mean to be human in a world designed to dehumanize? W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the most influential African-American intellectuals of the 20th century, introduced the concept of double consciousness. In his groundbreaking book, The Souls of Black Folk, 1903. This concept refers to the internal conflict experienced by subordinated or colonized groups in an oppressive society. For Du Bois, it was the struggle of African Americans to reconcile their African heritage with their American citizenship. This duality creates a fractured identity, where one constantly sees oneself through the prejudiced eyes of a dominant white society, leading to a perpetual state of self-awareness and self-evaluation. Du Bois wrote, "One ever feels his two-ness. An American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings." He portrayed the African-American experience not merely as a social injustice, but as a profound psychological and existential dilemma. This notion of double consciousness helps explain the mental burden of living under systemic racism. How identity is not only shaped by self-perception, but also by the way society marginalizes and otherizes. This keynote explores how Du Bois's concept remains deeply relevant today. In the age of social media and mass surveillance, minority individuals still often feel the need to perform acceptable versions of themselves to gain social acceptance or avoid discrimination. Cultural assimilation, code switching, and identity fragmentation are modern manifestations of double consciousness. Du Bois also emphasized the importance of education and political activism. He co-founded the W.E.B. and was a tireless advocate for civil rights, believing that a well-educated and politically active black intelligentsia, what he called the talented tenth, could uplift the entire race. His vision extended beyond mere integration into white society. He sought a world where black identity could flourish with dignity and pride. Ultimately, Du Bois challenged the moral and intellectual foundations of racism by offering a powerful philosophical lens through which to view the internal lives of the oppressed. He made visible the psychological toll of inequality and inspired generations of scholars, artists, and activists to explore identity, consciousness, and resistance in the face of systemic dehumanization. Frantz Fanon was a psychiatrist, philosopher, and revolutionary whose work remains a cornerstone in the study of colonialism and racial injustice. In Black Skin, White Masks, 1952, Fanon delved into the lived experience of the colonized subject, especially how racism distorts both the mind and body. He argued that colonial racism is not simply about economic exploitation or political domination. It invades the psyche. It leads to what he called epidermalization, the internalization of racial inferiority by the oppressed. Fanon experienced firsthand the duality of being in a white-dominated world. He explained how black individuals, taught to see themselves through the lens of white superiority, develop feelings of inadequacy and self-hate. This psychological violence is subtle but devastating. It makes the oppressed complicit in their own dehumanization by shaping their desires, aspirations, and self-perceptions in alignment with the oppressor's standards. In his later work, The Wretched of the Earth, 1961, Fanon explored the necessity of decolonization and the revolutionary process. He claimed that true liberation cannot come through negotiation or assimilation, but must involve the complete dismantling of colonial structures. Fanon's advocacy for violent resistance was controversial but rooted in his belief that liberation must be both physical and psychological. According to him, reclaiming identity and dignity requires a rupture with the colonial past. This keynote discusses how Fanon's ideas resonate in modern movements for racial justice. From the Black Lives Matter movement to global decolonization efforts in academia, his emphasis on psychological liberation has gained renewed importance. Fanon helps us understand that systemic change must address not just policy or representation, but the deeper layers of consciousness shaped by centuries of oppression. Fanon also critiqued the role of the post-colonial elite, warning that simply replacing white rulers with native elites without structural transformation would only perpetuate the colonial legacy. His insights push us to ask, who benefits from the current systems of power? Are we truly free, or merely reproducing colonial hierarchies under new names? Frantz Fanon's work remains a clarion call to interrogate not just what has been done to the oppressed, but what the oppressed have been made to believe about themselves. His philosophical depth and revolutionary fervor continue to inspire those who seek justice not just in law, but in the human soul. Kimberlé Crenshaw, a legal scholar and critical race theorist, revolutionized the way we understand social injustice with her theory of intersectionality. Coined in 1989, intersectionality highlights how different forms of discrimination, such as racism, sexism, classism, and more, interact and overlap, particularly for individuals who exist at the crossroads of multiple marginalized identities. For Crenshaw, focusing on race or gender alone was insufficient. Only by analyzing their intersection could we truly understand the lived experiences of black women and other marginalized people. Crenshaw's concept emerged from legal cases where black women plaintiffs were unable to prove discrimination because courts evaluated racism and sexism separately. For instance, if a company hired black men and white women, a court might conclude that there was neither race nor gender discrimination, even if black women were systematically excluded. Intersectionality exposed the limitations of legal frameworks that treated identity categories as isolated and mutually exclusive. This keynote examines how Crenshaw's theory reorients social justice thinking. By emphasizing complexity, intersectionality reveals how systems of oppression are interconnected. It has since been adopted in disciplines such as sociology, education, and public health, as well as grassroots movements advocating for inclusive feminism, racial justice, and LGBT rights. Intersectionality also plays a key role in understanding systemic inequality. For example, a low-income, disabled woman of color may experience a compounded form of discrimination that is qualitatively different from what wealthier white women or able-bodied black men experience. Crenshaw's insight urges policymakers and activists to avoid one-size-fits-all solutions and instead adopt nuanced approaches that recognize interlocking systems of disadvantage. Critics of intersectionality sometimes dismiss it as overly academic or divisive. However, Crenshaw has consistently emphasized its practical implications. In speeches and writings, she calls it a lens, rather than a theory, a way of seeing that brings hidden realities into focus. It is not about ranking oppressions, but about understanding the full scope of injustice. Crenshaw's work challenges us to ask whose voices are we ignoring when we simplify identity? How can justice be served if our systems don't recognize the complexity of human experience? In a world that too often seeks simplicity, Crenshaw reminds us that justice requires precision and compassion for difference. Charles W. Mills, a Jamaican philosopher, made a groundbreaking intervention in political philosophy with his 1997 book The Racial Contract. In this work, Mills argues that the traditional social contract theories of Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, and Kant were not intended to include non-white people. Instead, he posits that Western political systems operate under a racial contract, an unspoken agreement among white people to maintain their power and privilege at the expense of non-white populations. According to Mills, the racial contract is not a historical accident, but a foundational element of modern political systems. It governs who is considered fully human, who deserves rights, and who is subject to violence or neglect. The contract is epistemological as well. It shapes not only laws and institutions, but also knowledge itself, including what counts as objective truth, rationality, and moral worth. This keynote delves into how Mills's theory exposes the racialized underpinnings of supposedly neutral ideas like democracy, liberty, and justice. He criticizes mainstream political philosophy for ignoring the racial context in which these ideas emerged. For instance, Locke's theory of property and liberty was developed while he invested in companies profiting from the Atlantic slave trade. Mills invites us to reconsider these canonical figures not as universal thinkers, but as contributors to a system that privileged whiteness. Mills's racial contract helps explain the persistent racial disparities in areas like education, policing, healthcare, and housing. These are not policy failures, but reflections of a deeper, structural agreement that defines who belongs and who does not. By making this contract visible, Mills empowers us to imagine alternative forms of social organization grounded in true equality. He also emphasizes that the racial contract is dynamic. It evolves, adapts, and disguises itself in new forms. From Jim Crow laws to mass incarceration, the mechanisms change, but the underlying agreement remains intact. Mills's work challenges us to confront not just individual prejudice, but the very architecture of racial domination. This keynote encourages us to reflecting. What would society look like if it were built on an anti-racial contract? How do we rewrite the rules of inclusion and justice when the foundations themselves are compromised? Charles Mills doesn't just critique the status quo. He calls us to reimagine what a truly inclusive democracy could be. Martin Luther King Jr. is often celebrated for his dream of racial harmony, but his deeper message was one of moral urgency, radical love, and structural transformation. In his letter from Birmingham Jail, 1963, King responded to white clergy who urged him to wait for a more appropriate time to protest injustice. He wrote, "Justice too long delayed is justice denied," warning that moderate calls for patience often serve to uphold the status quo. King's philosophy was grounded in Christian ethics, natural law, and nonviolent resistance. He believed that unjust laws were those out of harmony with moral law, and that individuals had a moral responsibility to disobey them. His nonviolence was not passive. It was active resistance to evil, rooted in love, and aimed at winning over the opponent. This keynote revisits King's intellectual legacy beyond popular quotations. It examines his critique of capitalism, his opposition to the Vietnam War, and his Poor People's Campaign, which aimed to unite the disenfranchised across racial lines. King understood that racial injustice could not be separated from economic exploitation and militarism, what he called the triple evils. King's notion of the beloved community envisioned a society where all people could share in the wealth of the earth, and where love and justice would reign supreme. This was not utopian idealism, but a radical reimagining of societal values. He believed that transformation required not just changing laws, but also changing hearts and systems. In today's context, King's words remain prophetic. Movements for Black lives, economic justice, and climate equity all echo his call for interconnected justice. His insistence on confronting uncomfortable truths and demanding immediate action remains as vital now as it was in the 1960s. This keynote challenges us to embrace King not just as a symbol of peace, but as a thinker who demanded transformation. His life and writings remind us that justice cannot wait, that the time to act is always now. From the soul-deep reflections of Du Bois to the structural reimaginings of Mills, from Fanon's psychological liberation to Crenshaw's multidimensional justice, and from King's urgent moral clarity. These thinkers teach us that racism is not a simple error to be corrected, but a complex system to be dismantled. Their wisdom compels us to confront not only the world around us, but also the assumptions within us. They remind us that justice is not a static achievement, but a constant pursuit, an echo that must be answered in every generation. Until we build a world where dignity is not conditional and inclusion is not negotiable, their voices must continue to challenge, inspire, and awaken.